She suggested the coffee shop near where we had grown up. I understood the choice immediately. Familiar ground. The particular comfort of a place that carries shared history. A setting designed to remind both of us of who we had been. I arrived first, found a table, ordered, and thought about the last time I had sat somewhere waiting for Emma. How different that version of me had been. How much of his stability had depended on her being present. How completely that dependency had defined him. She came in about 5 minutes after me, looked around the room, found me, and for just a moment before she crossed the room, I watched her face. The particular expression of someone arriving at a situation they have rehearsed, who has already decided how it is going to go. She had come back expecting to find the person she left, the one who would have been waiting, who would have been grateful she came back at all, who needed her in the specific way he had always needed her. She sat down across from me, and I watched the rehearsed version of the next hour begin to adjust in real time. Because I was not who she had come back for. That person was gone, had been gone for a long time, and I was entirely at peace with that. But to understand why that table felt the way it did, you need to know what the 10 years between looked like. Emma and I had been together since we were 16. Not the casual kind of teenage relationship that exists in the background of a life still being shaped by other things. The kind that becomes the primary relationship. The one that organizes everything around it. That defines how you understand yourself in relation to another person before you have fully understood yourself at all. We grew up in the same neighborhood, had known each other since before either of us was old enough to think about what knowing someone meant. The transition from knowing each other to being together happened gradually. The way those transitions happen when two people have been in each other's lives long enough that the question of whether they belong together stops feeling like a question. It just starts to feel like the obvious fact of things. She was the first person I had loved in the full sense. Not the rehearsal version of love that exists before you understand what love costs. The real version. The one that involves genuine vulnerability. That requires you to let someone matter to you more than your own comfort. That teaches you things about yourself that you cannot learn in the absence of that kind of connection. I was 17 when I understood I loved her. 23 when she left. 6 years of being together that had shaped who I was in ways I wouldn't fully understand until years after she was gone. The early years of the relationship were uncomplicated in the way that things are uncomplicated before life introduces its complexity. School ending. University beginning. The particular transition of two young people who have been each other's primary reference point navigating the expansion of their worlds without losing the thing between them. We managed it, not without difficulty, but with the specific commitment of two people who had decided they were building towards something. I was deeply invested in her, not possessively, but completely. She was the person I thought about when I thought about the future, the presence I organized my plans around. The relationship I believed was the foundation of whatever came next. She was the first person I called with anything significant, the person whose opinion shaped my decisions. The anchor of my emotional life in a way that I didn't examine critically because it had always been that way. Looking back now, I understand that the depth of my investment had created a specific vulnerability. Not a flaw, just a reality. When you have built your sense of yourself around another person's presence for 6 years, their absence doesn't just leave a gap. It destabilizes something structural. Emma started to change in the final year. Not dramatically, gradually. The way people change when they're outgrowing something and don't yet know how to say so. She became interested in things that didn't include me. Not deliberately exclusionary. Just the natural expansion of someone who was discovering that the world was larger than what the two of us had built together. She got a job in a different city. A good one. Something she had worked toward. Something that deserved to be celebrated. I celebrated it, while quietly understanding that its implications for us were significant. We tried the distance. For about 8 months. It was difficult in the specific ways that distance is difficult when a relationship has always been built on proximity, on the everyday presence of someone in your life, on the particular intimacy that comes from sharing ordinary moments rather than managing a relationship across the space between two cities. The conversation that ended things happened over a weekend visit. She was direct, kinder than she needed to be. Said she had been honest with herself about what she wanted, that the life she was building was moving in a direction that didn't include coming back, that she had met someone, that she was sorry, that she had never intended to hurt me, that she genuinely hoped I would be okay. I received it with more composure than I felt, said the right things, let her leave without making it worse than it was, closed the door behind her, and then spent the next several months discovering exactly how much of my stability had been built on her being in my life, which was more than I had known, significantly more. The aftermath was not clean. I want to describe it honestly, because the clean version of it would misrepresent what the next period actually required. The first few months were the months of simply getting through, not rebuilding, not growing. Just managing the daily experience of someone whose primary reference point had been removed and who had not yet found a replacement for it. Not a replacement for her specifically, a replacement for the structural role she had played. The person who made the ordinary meaningful, who made the future something you could picture, who made the present feel like it was pointing somewhere worth going. Without that structure, the present felt formless in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not unbearable. Just shapeless, like someone who has been given a large amount of time and no instruction for what to do with it. I want to work, maintain the surface of a functioning life. Saw friends, answered messages, did the things that a person does when they're keeping themselves operational while something underneath is recalibrating. Somewhere in the fourth month, something shifted. Small, not the dramatic turning point that these stories sometimes describe. Just the beginning of a different orientation. A morning where I woke up and the first thought was not about Emma. It was about something I wanted to do that day. Something I was curious about. Something that had nothing to do with her or the relationship or the absence of either. That morning was not the recovery. It was the signal that recovery was possible. And I held on to it, worked from it, let it become the direction. I had always been competent professionally. But competence is different from ambition, and ambition is different from a specific focus that becomes available when you're no longer organizing your life around another person's trajectory. I had ambition. I had simply never fully deployed it, because a significant portion of my energy had always been directed toward the relationship, toward maintaining it, nurturing it, planning within its constraints, imagining a future that fit around it. With that constraint gone, I turned the energy toward the work, not as a displacement activity, as a genuine investment in building something that was mine. My career developed in ways it had not developed while I was oriented around the relationship. Not because Emma had been holding me back, because I had been holding myself in a shape that fit the life I thought I was building. And the shape I actually needed was different from that. The work flourished. The financial position improved. The professional reputation began to build in the specific organic way that consistent, focused work builds reputation. Through results that people noticed. Through reliability that people came to depend on. Through the gradual accumulation of a track record that had its own weight. I built a life that was genuinely mine. Not a performance of having moved on. Not a demonstration designed for anyone's observation. Just an actual life, with its own texture and its own people and its own particular satisfactions. Friends who were close because I had invested in those friendships rather than treating them as supplements to the relationship. Interests pursued because they genuinely interested me. A way of being in the world that had been shaped by the years since Emma rather than by the years before. I dated, not immediately, not with urgency. When I was ready and with the specific understanding that the person I was looking for was someone who added to a life I had already made worth living. Not someone to replace the structural role Emma had played. not someone to fill the gap, someone who fit alongside something real. That distinction produced a different kind of relationship than the ones I had known before. More honest, more equal, less dependent on the other person's presence to feel complete. None of those relationships became permanent. Not because they were wrong, because the timing wasn't right, or the fit wasn't quite there, or life moved in directions that made continuation impractical. They ended cleanly, without the devastation that Emma's departure had produced, because I was not structured around them the way I had been structured around her. They mattered, and their ending was manageable. That difference told me something about how I had grown, about the distance between the person who had watched Emma walk out the door at 23 and the person I had become by the time my phone showed her name 10 years later. I looked at the notification for a long moment. Her name, a message asking if I would be open to catching up, that she was back in the area. That had been a long time, that she hoped I was well. Brief, careful, the kind of message someone writes when they are not certain of their reception. I thought about not responding. That option was available. Clean, requiring nothing. But curiosity is its own kind of pull. And I was curious, not about whether something was still there. I knew something was not still there. I had made genuine peace with that a long time ago. Curious about who she was now, about what the conversation would be, about whether I was actually as settled as I believed myself to be, or whether meeting her would reveal something I hadn't accounted for. I replied, said I was open to catching up, suggested the coffee shop. Her choice felt like the obvious one before she made it, and I was ready for whatever the afternoon would produce. She looked well. That was the first thing I noticed when she came through the door. Not unchanged. 10 years or 10 years. But well, the particular quality of someone who has lived a full life in the time between, who carries it visibly without being burdened by it. She smiled when she saw me. The specific smile of someone arriving at a moment they have been anticipating, with a particular expectation attached to it. I stood. We did the brief, awkward thing of two people who were once intimately close and are now navigating the physical greeting of strangers. The half hug that is neither one thing nor the other. She sat down. We ordered, and the conversation began in the way these conversations always begin, with the surface things. How long she had been back, how the journey was, what the area looked like compared to how we both remembered it. The particular small talk of two people feeling for the edges of a conversation before either commits to its real shape. She asked about my work. I told her, briefly, accurately, without performing anything. She received it with something that looked like genuine surprise. Not at the content specifically, at the manner of it, at the absence of the particular neediness she had perhaps expected to find underneath the surface account. The person who had watched her leave at 23 had been someone whose confidence was significantly tied to her presence, whose sense of his own value had been partly borrowed from the fact that she had chosen him. That person would have delivered an account of the last 10 years with a specific undercurrent. Look what I have done. Look who I have become. Look at what I built after you left. The account that needs to be impressive, that is delivering itself to an audience, that is still, in some way, in conversation with her departure rather than simply describing a life. Why I gave her was not that, just the facts of a decade, told the way you tell someone you are catching up with what you have been doing, without the subtext, without the performance, without any of the emotional loading that the version of me she had left would have been unable to avoid. She picked up on the difference. I could see it registering, the recalibration happening in real time. She told me about her life, the marriage, the city she had moved to, the things that had been good about that period, and then the things that had stopped being good, the ending of the marriage, the decision to come back. She told it honestly, without excessive self-pity, with the matter-of-fact quality of someone who has processed enough of it to describe it cleanly. I listened genuinely, not waiting for my opportunity to respond, actually listening. What she described was a life that had contained real things, real experiences, real choices made with the information available at the time, that had arrived somewhere more complicated than she had expected. as lives tend to. I felt something during that account that surprised me slightly. Not the complicated mixture of satisfaction and residual hurt that I might have expected. Just compassion. Uncomplicated. The specific compassion you feel for someone whose life has been genuinely difficult. Regardless of history. Regardless of what the history between us had been. She was a person who had been through something hard. And I was someone who understood what hard things feel like. That was the full extent of what I felt. Nothing underneath it. No satisfaction at her difficulty. No rekindling of something I had believed extinguished. No resentment surfacing from the years the ending had cost me. Just the clean compassion of someone who had finished carrying something and could therefore hold the weight of it without being affected by it. The conversation moved through its natural stages. The catching up, the filling in of the decade, the particular texture of two people who had known each other deeply and were now knowing each other as something different. Not strangers, not what they had been, something without a clean category. At some point in the second hour, she said something that made the shape of the afternoon visible. She said she had thought about reaching out for a long time, that she wasn't entirely sure what she had expected, that it was strange to be sitting here, that I seemed different from how she remembered. I asked her how she remembered. She thought about it before answering. Said she remembered someone who needed things more visibly, who was less settled in himself, who would have been easier to read in this situation. I told her she was right, that that person had existed, that the 10 years had produced someone considerably different. She nodded and looked at the table for a moment, in a specific way of someone understanding something that changes the shape of what they thought they were walking into. The shift happened gradually over the second hour. Not a single moment. A series of small adjustments to the posture of the conversation. Emma arriving incrementally at the understanding that the afternoon was not going to produce what she had come expecting. I want to describe what I observed carefully, because I am not certain I understood all of it in the moment. Some of it I understood afterward, sitting with the afternoon once it had finished, looking back at the shape of it with the clarity that a little distance provides. She had come back with a version of me already assembled in her mind, built from the person she had known at 23, updated with whatever she had imagined the intervening years had produced. Her imagination had produced someone who had rebuilt, but who still carried the specific emotional signature of someone who had loved her and lost her. Someone who would be glad she had reached out, relieved to see her, open to whatever the conversation might become, not desperate, but available, in the specific way that people remain available for the relationships that shape them most deeply. Even when they believe they have moved on, I had moved on, not as a performance, not as a position I was maintaining for the sake of the afternoon. Actually, the person she had assembled in her mind did not exist at the table. I was there, a different version, and the adjustment required to understand the difference was something I watched happen across the second hour. She asked questions that had a particular texture to them, about whether I was seeing anyone, about what my life looked like on ordinary evenings, about whether I had stayed in contact with the mutual friends we had once shared. The questions of someone taking inventory, assessing the landscape, looking for the signals that told her where things stood and what was possible. I answered honestly, not strategically, not with any design toward a particular impression, just accurately. I was not seeing anyone seriously at the moment. My life on ordinary evenings was genuinely full without requiring anyone specific to make it so. The mutual friends had mostly dispersed in the way that mutual friends do when the relationship that connected them dissolves. She received each answer, each one telling her something about the landscape she was assessing, each one slightly different from what she had expected. At some point, she said something quietly, that she had not realized how much had changed. Not accusingly, just as an observation, the kind that sounds simple and means more than it sounds. I told her that a lot had changed, that I had changed, not all at once, over years, through the particular process of someone rebuilding a life that had been built around someone else, and learning to build it around themselves instead. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she had missed me. Said it simply, without embellishment. Just placed it in the conversation and let it sit there. I looked at her, the person across the table who had been the most significant relationship of my early life, who had shaped things about me that were still visible in who I had become, who had left in a way that had cost me significantly and produced something in me that was worth having been produced. I felt the weight of the statement, not the pull of it. The difference between those two things was everything. The weight I felt was real. The acknowledgement that this person had mattered, that what we had been real, that missing it was a legitimate thing to feel. The pull was absent. The specific desire to move toward something, to reopen something, to allow what she was offering to become what she appeared to be hoping it might become. That was simply not there, and its absence was not a performance of distance. It was the honest reality of someone who had made genuine peace with a closed chapter, who could sit with the weight of the history without being pulled by it toward a future it did not belong in. I told her I appreciated her saying that I had missed her too, in the years immediately after, that the missing had been real and had lasted longer than I would have chosen, and that it had eventually done what grief does when you let it run its course properly. It had resolved into something that no longer had the quality of missing, just the quality of memory, of something that had existed and mattered and was genuinely over. She looked at me in the specific way of someone receiving information that closes a door they had come expecting to find open. Not with anger, with the particular sadness of understanding, the realization landing cleanly, that the person she had come back for was not at the table, had not been at the table for a long time, and would not be found by continuing the conversation in any direction she might take it. We stayed at the table for another 30 minutes after that exchange. Not because there was more to resolve, because the conversation needed to find its natural conclusion rather than ending on the weight of what had just been said. Both of us understanding that abruptly leaving would give that moment more significance than the afternoon deserved. So we continued, more lightly than before. The particular texture of a conversation that has said the important things and is now breathing out. She asked about some of the places we had known growing up, whether certain things were still there. I answered where I knew. We talked about people we had both known. The ordinary catching up that these conversations contain when the significant things have been addressed, and what remains is the human warmth of two people who once knew each other well. That warmth was real. I want to be clear about that. There was genuine ease in parts of the conversation, the specific comfort of someone familiar, of shared references, of the particular shorthand that forms between people who grew up in the same place at the same time. None of that had disappeared. It had simply been separated from everything that could not exist alongside it. The warmth without the pull, the familiarity without the availability, the genuine pleasure of the afternoon without the openness to anything beyond it. She seemed to settle into that. Not immediately, gradually, the adjustment completing itself over the final 30 minutes into something more honest than the opening of the conversation had been. By the time we paid and stood to leave, the dynamic had shifted, not to something comfortable exactly, to something real. Two people who had known each other genuinely, who had spent an afternoon in the honest company of who they had both become, without pretending the history didn't exist, without pretending it created an opening it no longer created. We stood outside the coffee shop, the same neighborhood that had held both of us when we were 16. Older now, changed in the way that neighborhoods change over a decade, and both of us changed alongside it. She said it had been good to see me, said it with something that had settled in it, not the charged version of the same words that might have been said at the beginning of the afternoon, just the genuine version, clean. I told her likewise, and meant it. She said she hoped things continued to go well. I said the same. We hugged in a way that was slightly less awkward than the one at the beginning. The specific improvement that honest conversation produces in the physical language between people. She walked toward her car. I walked toward mine. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. Ran through the afternoon, not analytically, just letting it settle. What I felt was not what I might have predicted if I had been asked beforehand. Not elation, not the specific satisfaction of a power dynamic reversed, not the particular pleasure of being the one who had moved on while she had returned to find the door closed. None of those things. Something quieter, a kind of completeness, the feeling of a loop closed. Not dramatically, just finally. The last remaining question of that part of my life answered in an afternoon. The question being not whether she would come back, but whether I was who I believed myself to be. Whether the decade of building had produced what I thought it had produced. Whether the peace I felt about that chapter was genuine or maintained. The afternoon had answered that. Clearly, without ambiguity, the peace was genuine. The person I had become was the person I believed I had become. The absence of the pull was not a performance I had been keeping up. It was simply true. That knowledge was worth the afternoon. Whatever else the meeting had been. It had been a clean confirmation of something I had not needed confirmed. But that felt different for having been confirmed. I drove home through streets I had known my whole life, thinking about 16-year-old versions of both of us, who could not have imagined this afternoon, who would have found it incomprehensible that such a conversation could happen and feel the way it felt. More peaceful than painful, more complete than complicated, with the particular lightness of someone who has just understood that they are exactly where they are supposed to be, in a life built entirely by themselves, that fits them entirely, and that requires nothing from the person who once seemed like the only possible center of it. I didn't hear from Emma after that afternoon. Not a follow-up message. Not a thank you for meeting. Not the kind of brief, friendly contact that sometimes follows a reunion that went better than expected. Just silence, which was the appropriate conclusion. Not cold, just complete. We had said what needed to be said, had arrived together at the honest shape of where things stood. There was nothing left that required further exchange. The silence was not absence. It was resolution, and I was entirely comfortable inside it. I thought about the afternoon a few times in the days that followed. Not obsessively, not with any lingering emotional weight. Just the natural processing of something significant. The way your mind returns to an experience not because it is unresolved, but because it contained enough that it deserves more than a single pass. What I kept returning to was the specific feeling of sitting across from her and feeling nothing I hadn't chosen to feel. Not the absence of feeling. The presence of only what was actually there. Compassion for her difficulty. Genuine warmth for the history between us. Appreciation for an afternoon that had confirmed something important. None of the complicated residue I might have expected. The hurt that I might have thought was still somewhere underneath. The specific longing that first loves tend to leave behind them. The ghost of the person I had been at 23 who had needed her in a way the person I was at 33 simply did not. All of that was genuinely gone. Not suppressed. Processed through. Over years of ordinary life lived with full attention. There is something I want to say about how that processing happened. Because it is easy to describe the outcome and imply that the outcome arrived through some particular discipline or decision. It didn't. It arrived through time and ordinary living, through the accumulated experience of a decade of showing up to my own life without the specific dependency that had defined the years with Emma. Every day of building something that was mine. Every relationship that mattered on its own terms. Every morning that began with my own thoughts rather than with the particular orientation of someone whose center of gravity is outside themselves. All of that ordinary living had produced the person who sat across from Emma that afternoon, not through effort directed at recovering from her specifically, through effort directed at building something genuinely worth having. The recovery had been a byproduct, not the goal, and that distinction was important, because people who make recovery the goal tend to stay oriented toward the thing they are recovering from, keep it in the center of their attention, measure their progress against it, remain, in the most fundamental sense, still in relationship with it. even while trying to leave it behind. I had not done that, not deliberately, just through the natural redirection of energy toward things that were present and real and worth building. And somewhere in that redirection, the recovery had happened without being noticed, until an afternoon in a coffee shop had revealed that it was complete. I called Daniel a few days after the meeting, my closest friend, told him about it. He listened in the way he always listened. Then he said something that made me laugh. Said he wished he could have been there, not to watch anything dramatic, just to see the look on my face when I realized how okay I actually was. I told him I would describe it as unremarkable. He said that was the best possible description. He was right. The most significant thing about the afternoon was how unremarkable it had felt. Not in the content of it, in the emotional register, the absence of the particular intensity that a meeting like that should theoretically produce. No racing heart, no reawakened longing, no complicated mixture of old feelings and new circumstances. Just two people, coffee, an honest conversation, and a clean goodbye. The unremarkableness of it was the proof of everything the decade had actually produced. I think about the version of me at 23 sometimes, not with condescension, with the specific tenderness you feel for an earlier version of yourself. The person who watched Emma leave and felt the floor shift underneath him, who spent months learning to stand without the structure he had built around her presence, who rebuilt slowly and without any certainty that the rebuilding would produce anything worth having. That person deserves some acknowledgement, not for what he suffered, for what he did with it, for choosing day by day to build something real, not as a monument to having moved on, not as a demonstration for anyone's benefit, just as the ordinary responsible act of someone who understands that the life in front of them is the only life they have, and that it deserves full attention, regardless of what the life behind them contained. Emma had left looking for someone who still existed in the shape she remembered, someone whose center of gravity she could still walk back into. She had found someone who had relocated that center completely, who had moved it inside himself years ago, and who had built everything since from that new position. That relocation was the work of a decade. Quiet, undramatic, done in ordinary days without announcement. And it had produced the most important thing. Not the career, not the financial stability, not the professional reputation. The specific freedom of someone who is entirely themselves, who does not need any particular person's return to feel complete, who can sit across from the most significant relationship of their early life and feel nothing but genuine warmth and genuine peace. That freedom is not something anyone gives you. It is not something that arrives through a single decision. It is the accumulated result of years of choosing yourself, of investing in a life that belongs entirely to you, of building something so genuinely worth having that the question of whether someone else is coming back to it becomes genuinely secondary. I drove home from that coffee shop lighter than I had arrived, not because anything dramatic had happened, because nothing had needed to, because I had sat across from my past, had looked at it clearly, had felt exactly what was actually there, and had walked away confirmed in the most important knowledge available to any person, that they are enough, exactly as they are, without anyone's return to complete them. Some people come back expecting to find the person they left, and the greatest gift you can give yourself is becoming someone that person no longer exists to be found. If this story resonated with you, the quiet decade of building, the freedom that comes from choosing yourself, leave it in the comments. I read every one, and the next story is already waiting for you.